Bill McCluggage, wonderful to have you here with us today. For those who don't know you, you're former Chief Information Officer for the Irish Government. You're former Deputy Chief Information Officer for the UK Government. But well beyond that, you've worked in cybersecurity and technology with all sorts of private entities and governments and public bodies. So we're thrilled to have you here today to chat to us about cybersecurity in particular.
Well, thanks very much, Anne, for having me. It's such an interesting topic as we morph into, a full digital environment.
Yeah, well, exactly that. The fact that we're also, so much of our lives and our work and our business is online now. So tell us a little bit about how crucial cybersecurity has become, but also maybe how your own interest in cybersecurity really began.
Yeah, I started out in the aerosystems environment. So I was on electronics and software for the aerospace industry. And then I moved into the shipyard. I became IT director in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. And that was the first introduction I had into major IT systems. And then from that point onwards, I've moved into government, managing projects, IT operations. And then over the last sort of 8 years, I've moved into cybersecurity, information assurance and counter fraud, the outcome of some of the stuff you see whenever you get attacked. There must be a payment, a repayment and a commercialization, a monetization as they call it, of the attacks and the breaches, and that ends up being you and I defrauded. And
tell us a bit about your background in cybersecurity and where you would have really, got into the weeds on it. I'm thinking of things like the open banking.
I started out in IT and IT operations, and in 2016 I was called when I was in London by a cybersecurity company who turned around to me and said, would you be interested in a role that's coming up in the UK's open banking programme? And I said, well, it'd be interesting to find out what it's all about. So I went across to Tower Bridge and was interviewed, and lo and behold, I became the head of information assurance, counter fraud, and that started a 3-year journey right from the ground up when it was a greenfield site. It wasn't just a brownfield site, it was a completely greenfield site of building the UK's open banking infrastructure and making sure it was secure.
And that must have been some learning. I presume if you were starting from scratch, I presume the levels of security there must be huge.
It was fun, it was scary, it was cowboy territory. We had lots of devs and developers in with their own machines, so we had a completely cloud-first strategy at the front end of that, and that meant we were looking at cloud hosting hyperscalers like AWS, and we based all of our infrastructure on cloud-based technologies. We had GitHub repositories, lots and lots of stuff which just sprung up, and in the first 18 months it was sheer havoc. We had very, very tight objectives set by the Competition and Markets Authority, and we had to work with the 9 largest banks in the UK, financial institutions, because the building societies don't like to be called banks, so financial institutions, and that was a collaboration to get the whole of the infrastructure that sits behind open banking secured, but also to allow it as far as possible to be a frictionless journey for the user.
And any cybersecurity frights in that time?
I think the interesting one was, well, I've got a couple. The first one was, in the first year, we generated as many, we call it technical debt, but we just decided whenever we went out to have a look at our supply chain that we would place some of our capability in one company, another piece of the capability in another company, and friction always happens between two things, and there was a big hole. And it was only after about a year that we realized how much patching needed to be done. And that really did terrify me a bit. That kept me up at night for a considerable time until we got that sorted. And then we went into a contract with a dispute management service. So whenever you have an open banking issue, you have a dispute resolution capability, but that needs to be dealt with by a DMS, a dispute management service. And we got a subcontractor to do that for us. And then when we went in to look at that, we found that the coding had been done in Europe, and one of the coders had walked off with a lot of the source code, and we had to do a full check to make sure that nothing in the background was actually a problem. So there was some really scary moments. All like everything, like when you go to Disney or you go to the rides in the park, that's that fear sometimes generates a bit of a buzz. So it was fun, but it was also a bit scary.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's a lot of responsibility and accountability. There's no doubt about it. And speaking of, I suppose, responsibility, I was very interested that recently you were involved in creating a course, basically, if I'm correct, for the Institute of Directors here, really aimed at leaders about governance when it comes to cybersecurity. And I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think whenever you look at me, you turn around and say, right, okay, it's fairly senior. And I have been in some fairly senior roles. And all of the time I find it very difficult to simplify what seem to be complex problems, and specifically at board level. Whenever you've got non-specialists who are being introduced into an environment where they're not technical specialists, a lot of them are finance, they understand finance, they know spreadsheets, they can understand the due diligence you need to do with customers. But when it comes to IT and, more importantly, cybersecurity, it does scare people a bit, because you hear all of these horrible instances of fraud, of hacking, of ransomware, and then you turn around and say, why did that happen? Why wasn't it controlled and managed at senior level by a board? And I was asked to develop a program for directors to understand cyber risk. And we put together a program with 4 modules, a fairly long program, 4 modules, but they were fairly sharp, but it was over about 8 weeks or so. And board directors could come along and query some of the issues they felt they had. They could do case studies, and they learned a bit about the legal and compliance regimes that obviously come almost centre stage at board level to risk management.
And I mean, this is kind of the irony of, I suppose, the importance of that knowledge at board level, because the compliance and legal implications are huge, obviously. I suppose in that context as well, regulation is becoming tougher, I think. Would that be fair to say? What are your
I think
own
the
thoughts
experience, like every industry and every epoch, you end up with being a bit of a Wild West to start with, and as it matures, regulators become involved, and certainly whenever there are customer and victims of cyber fraud and the cyber hacking, etc., then you end up with regulators, compliance regimes coming in. So it's not unusual to have that. And obviously board members look at this and to a certain extent can be quite worried that they don't understand. It's not becoming a specialist, not becoming a specialist in cybersecurity that matters. It's understanding. I've always asked the question, do you understand what it is you're trying to achieve from a governance perspective? And then asking those questions. And I think I mentioned to you before, I have this thing about reassurance versus assurance. Mm-hmm. So reassurance is when somebody comes along and said it'll be okay on the night, don't worry about it, we've got it all covered. And that always gives me a little bit of indigestion whenever I look at that and I go, excuse me, I'd like to see it. You don't go into your bank account and say, excuse me, it's all right, you've got enough money, don't worry about it. You don't go online and the bank comes back to you and said, it's all right, you've got some money to spend. You go in and you want to know each of the individual transactions. Well, it's exactly the same with cybersecurity governance and risk governance. You want to be able to go in and see that things have been done and milestones have been met and patching is occurring. You don't need to understand necessarily what it is that's happening, but you do need to know that it's providing you with that capability and specialist capability that's inside your business to defend yourself.
And I mean, that makes me think, I mean, what these people really need is, amazing talent within their organizations as well, who really know what they're doing. I think that would be fair to say when it comes to cybersecurity. Like, you look at a lot of the statistics and there seems to be a little bit of a lack of skills out there. Is that an issue, do you think?
I think it's always a problem in any industry, getting the right capacity and capability. And that capability comes with skills and people. So when you look at it, nothing is new under the sun. It's about people, processes and technology. So if you don't have the right people there, you run a risk of not picking up all of the things you need to do. And they are scarce, although they're becoming more diverse in terms of the different areas that people are looking at. So, whenever you move into DevSecOps, it's these fancy terms, development, security, operations, right? You're looking at that, trying to merge the security function with the development and the agile function, and that's my experience in open banking. was we had devs, we had engineers and test engineers, and we had DevSecOps. Now, I'll give you an interesting example of where risk cropped in. We had an information technology issue going on. It wasn't cybersecurity, it was actually about the environment and the architecture, and there was a bit of a glitch. And the person with the security keys, the access control, we found was only one individual, and that individual was on a plane to Sydney, Australia. So there was he literally had to land. When he landed in Dubai, we were talking to him on the phone at midnight, getting his input into this IT operations issue. So that throws out, procedures and process. Not about the technology. It's about how the business has been designed to operate, and understanding the risks you run in having, all of the, excuse the analogy, all the eggs in one basket, and not having them spread out, and having, dual control and dual keys and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it brings in, I suppose, the human question as well. And I know you and I have discussed this before, but you get a lot of anecdotal kind of, blaming the human, it was a fault by one human, that's where the breach happened. Or, I mean, can we blame the human, or is it about processes? And
I think humans have to be professional, and they have to do what they're paid to do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are to blame. A blame culture is fairly negative. I think what happens whenever you've got issues most of the process failures, it's easier to blame an individual than it is to turn around and say, I as a senior manager should have picked up that this process wasn't correct, or it needed to be changed or evolved. And then you tend to finger point to an individual. I come back to the fact that, Chief Information Security Officer is CISO, and it can stand for career is suddenly over if you end up in a situation where that blame culture is there, and you are blamed for not having the capability to fix a problem. When quite frankly, in many instances, it's supply chain failure, which is nothing to do with the security per se within the business. It's about due diligence in the supply chain function, and have items been written in the contractual terms with your supplier that they need to assure themselves to a certain level. So over the last few months, a couple of years, it's becoming quite common now to have major supply chain breaches, which then affect the client, and that then brings opens a door into attacking the main customer of the target of the cyber hacker.
And one thing I loved you spoke to me before about is this idea that it's not just about developers. When it comes to cybersecurity, there's a huge amount of psychology, behavioral analysis, anthropology, whatever whatever it might be. I mean, do we need to look at bringing more of that pool of people into the field?
Well, I think diversity is great, because you get different lenses on the problem. So gender diversity, ethnic diversity, and also specialist diversity. So when you look at some of the stuff we do in an office, lately we've been looking at culture, and the culture of an organisation and the operation, to actually combat some of the traits of cyber hackers and the vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are in people. There was an incident over the weekend, which was largely reported, where a individual had been scammed. Scam is a terrible word, but had been attacked on a virtual conference with who he thought was a CFO, and that was all done via deepfake. And that financier in Hong Kong signed off payments to the tune of 200 million Hong Kong dollars. That's 25 million pounds sterling, $25 million-ish, around that terminal, that amount. And that was all done because he thought he was looking and having video meetings with his CFO, who was authorizing him to do certain actions. That wasn't technology, nothing to do with technology. Yes, deep fake technology, but it was more about processes and procedures that enabled that individual to feel comfortable to do certain things that maybe should have had a light come on in his head to turn and say, am I doing the right thing here, and maybe querying it. It's very difficult to turn around and say to your boss, who you think is in front of you, no, I'm not going to do that. So it is a lot to do with workplace psychology and having that understanding of how businesses operate.
You mentioned deepfakes there, and they have got pretty sophisticated, but you would think in a zero trust environment that payment would not have gone through. I'm just wondering, is zero trust the solution here?
Well, I think in that environment, it was a process failure, probably, whereby there wasn't a second check and balance in place. So, you know, when you say, you know, is there a capability to put zero trust in? I think, yes, it starts with zero trust because you don't trust the process and you don't trust the individual. And therefore you have a checks and balance which says, excuse me, you know, you have to be checked. This is not because we don't like you or we think you're not doing your job. It's just, it protects the organization. So whenever you look at other physical environments, there are checks and balances in there to make sure physically that you're safe, and we don't ever trust a single item to protect you. There's always things that are there, and that's my background from the aerospace industry, is that security software that powers aircraft, it's critical software. It's checked again, and there are more than one set of eyeballs on that issue, more than one set of tests. So in the same way, financially, that could have been avoided, I think, not knowing the detail of it, by checks and balances and 2 sign-offs or something like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Like, that's a large amount of money to sign off on. I suppose, again, coming back to things like deepfakes, you know, we have to talk about generative AI because everybody's talking about it, but it has an implication for cybersecurity as well, majorly, I would think.
I think you've got to consider it the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And on the good side, it is fantastic because it's allowing us to do certain things that are much quicker. It's really creative. It's allowing us to delve into areas where we've not had the time, the capability or capacity to do things, and lo and behold, we now can look at things, especially if you're looking at diagnostics in terms of cancer diagnostics, DNA analysis. All of that stuff is really powerful. But on the other side, it also can enable the attacker to do things quicker. The Gen AI models now are actually providing the attacker with the capabilities to actually generate the emails that will penetrate you if the social engineering has been done correctly. And it is getting very, very actually vicious, because whenever you look at what's happening from a fraud perspective, a couple of examples from the US where voice fakes have been taken of young children who have then called parents to say that they're in an alleyway and they're being attacked, and unless they pay $1,000, they will be sexually abused or disfigured with knives. And that is horrible. And yet it is being generated by vicious criminals who are targeting people. You know, just a matter of a few days ago, we had a Lurie Children's Hospital. Gone are the days whenever the cyber criminal has had any morals and wouldn't attack hospitals and wouldn't attack children's environments, etc. Now we're seeing the Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago being held to ransom, and that means that operations on vulnerable children are being put at risk. The health service executive is a classic example here in Ireland. You know, there's a lot of learnings come out of that, but hospitals, schools, none of them are now safe. And that is sad to say our society's got to a point where, you know, criminals are acting in that way.
And just staying on AI, you know, you were talking about how AI can help us to be more creative and more productive. Will AI help us stay in touch with, you know, how we deal with the criminals?
Yeah, I think now we're always playing a bit of a catch-up game, and AI can actually be used to help you defend. So there are a number of companies and products out there that are already using AI. In open banking, we were using anomaly detection from what was called an AI engine. I think it was more a machine learning engine. And we brought it in because we had a zero trust, we designed a zero trust environment, and we put on top of that a analytics engine that looked for anomaly detection between those zero trust environments. And that was 4 or 5 years ago. So I'm not, we shouldn't look at this and going, the Gen AI culture is way out ahead. Actually, there are capabilities developed by a lot of the vendors in the cyber market that have been working on this for many, many years to get to a point where they're providing capability. It's down to the architect and the CIO and the board to understand what tools they need to counter these types of threats, and they are out there. The market will follow.
And I suppose you touched on it there, but it's easy to, to be a bit gloomy about, the future, and I mean the sheer number from state actors to the criminals to the lack of ethics and morals amongst hackers. It's easy to be kind of gloomy, but I mean the industry, is it doing a good job of protecting us, and will it continue to do so?
The industry is doing a good job, and there are a number of vendors out there who are doing a lot of great work. I was emailing exactly this morning the west coast of the US to a company I've been working with, and they're doing fantastic work. And I was asking the question is where is quantum, where is AI within your roadmap and your strategy? And it's interesting to find that it's already there. I was with a company in London, with one of my board. I'm a non-exec director, and we were talking about AI at a meeting. We'd actually been invited to go and have a look, and it was fascinating how the considerations of how you look at large language models, because there's always a risk of data privacy and the leaking of data, and how can you then contain the private information, the PII inside your own environment, and only release prompts and queries that you need to outside the business. The danger, of course, is that some organisations, and recently the UK's Department of Works and Pensions has basically said, no, you can't use Gen AI. I think that's spurred on by the fact that they believe that there's not a capability to defend against it yet. And I think that probably in their situation, they may have taken the right decision because they haven't introduced a culture, AI policies, all of the things that protect you aren't there yet. So it'll be a little bit of time before they can start to exploit it. But other industries, the entertainment industry, the transport industry are starting to use it. The research industry have been using it quite for a while now, and it's good to see. So let's not be negative. I think Gen AI is positive, but we just need to make sure that we catch the bad bits of it and the bad actors by tooling up and getting some capability to respond.
I think that's a very good piece of advice to end on. So, Bill McCluggage, thank you so much for sitting down with us today. That was wonderful. Thank you.
It's been fun. Thank you very much indeed, Anne, and I hope it's been beneficial.
I'm sure it will be. Thank you.
Thank you.